April 1814. For a decade, one man had held Europe in his iron grip, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. His military genius had built an empire that stretched across the continent, but now, at last, he had been defeated. A grand coalition of enemies had forced his abdication, and Napoleon was exiled to the tiny island of Elba. In his place, the Bourbon monarchy was restored, with the corpulent Louis XVIII sitting uneasily on the throne of France. Yet, in exile, Napoleon's mind was restless. Rumors reached him that France was discontent. The people had no love for the monarchy, nor for the nobles who had returned to power, the same aristocrats whose extravagance had led to the French Revolution 25 years before. Meanwhile, at the Congress of Vienna, his former enemies bickered over the fate of Europe. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon decided to act. After just 10 months in exile, he set sail for France. Upon landing, the troops sent to arrest him instead rallied to his side. As he marched northward, more soldiers, then entire towns, welcomed him as their leader. Louis XVIII fled, and within days, Napoleon was once more Emperor of France. But the powers of Europe did not stand idly by. Putting aside their differences, they declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized their armies. Knowing he could not withstand a full-scale invasion, Napoleon moved swiftly, determined to strike a decisive blow before the coalition could unite against him. His target, the nearest Allied armies, the Prussians under Prince Blücher and the Anglo-Allied forces commanded by the Duke of Wellington, both stationed in Belgium. If Napoleon could keep these armies apart and defeat him separately, he might yet secure peace on his own terms. His army crossed the frontier near Charleroi, driving a wedge between his enemies. He sent his left wing, under Marshal Ney, to seize the crossroads at Quatre Bras. There, Ney encountered Wellington's forces, still scrambling into position. The battle was fierce, but Wellington's troops held their ground. Meanwhile, Napoleon himself engaged Blücher's Prussian army at the village of Ligny. The battle raged, a brutal contest of musket fire and cavalry charges. The 72-year-old Blücher led a cavalry assault himself, only to be unhorsed and barely escape capture. By nightfall, the Prussians were retreating, though not entirely broken. Napoleon, believing them defeated, dispatched Marshal Grouchy to pursue them and turned his attention to Wellington. But Wellington was not easily caught. Upon hearing of Blücher's defeat, he ordered a retreat through the rain, selecting a new position south of Brussels, near a small village called Waterloo. There, he resolved to make his stand, trusting that Blücher would return the favor and march to his aid. Dawn broke on June 18, 1815. Napoleon delayed his attack, waiting for the ground to dry, a decision that would later prove costly. When he finally moved, he began with a feint against the farmhouse of Hougoumont, hoping to draw Wellington's reserves. But the defenders, British and German troops, held firm. At one point, French soldiers forced their way inside the gate, only to be trapped and slaughtered. Wellington would later call this the decisive moment of the battle. At noon, Napoleon's main artillery opened fire, followed by a massed infantry assault. The French columns advanced but were met with disciplined British musket volleys and a devastating cavalry charge. The French attack crumbled. However, the British cavalry, in their eagerness, charged too far and were counterattacked by fresh French horsemen, suffering terrible losses. At 4 p.m., Marshal Ney believed the Allies were retreating. Seizing the moment, he launched a massive cavalry charge. But Wellington's infantry were ready, forming hollow squares with bayonets fixed. The French cavalry, unable to break these formations, circled in vain, suffering heavy losses. Worse still, Ney had failed to support the attack with infantry or artillery, a grave mistake. By evening, the battle hung in the balance. The French finally captured La Haye-Sainte, allowing them to bring artillery forward to pound Wellington's centre. The British line wavered, on the brink of collapse. But then, from the east, the Prussians arrived. They stormed the village of Plancenoit, threatening Napoleon's flank. The French were forced to divert their reserves to counter this new threat. In desperation, Napoleon called upon his ultimate weapon, the Imperial Guard, his most elite and feared troops. At 7:30 p.m., 3,000 of these veterans marched forward, determined to break Wellington's line. But the British, lying in wait, rose and fired volley after volley into the advancing French. The Guard, who had never before retreated in battle, faltered. When the British fixed bayonets and charged, the mighty Imperial Guard broke and ran. Seeing the Guard in retreat, Wellington sensed victory. He ordered a general advance. The Prussians surged forward, recapturing Plancenoit. Word spread through the French ranks that all was lost. Panic set in, and the army disintegrated, fleeing the battlefield. Only the Old Guard held firm, sacrificing themselves in a doomed rearguard action as Napoleon barely escaped capture. The battle was won. That night, Wellington and Blücher met outside Napoleon's former headquarters at La Belle Alliance. Blücher proposed naming their victory after the inn, but Wellington preferred the name of his own headquarters, Waterloo. The battle had been one of the bloodiest of its time, with 50,000 men killed or wounded. Due to a severe shortage of medical aid, many of the wounded lay suffering on the battlefield for days. Napoleon, utterly defeated, could raise no new army. He surrendered to the British and was exiled once more, this time to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena. There, he would remain until his death 6 years later. Waterloo marked the end of an era. It ushered in 40 years of relative peace in Europe, and for Britain, a century without another major continental war, until the fateful summer of 1914. Decades later, in the early days of photography, remarkable images were taken of the last surviving veterans of Napoleon's army. Old men now, in their 70s and 80s, they bore the memories of a bygone age. Among them was Sergeant Tanier of the Imperial Guard, Morat of the 2nd Regiment of Hussars, and Verlin of the 2nd Guard Lancers. Their faces, frozen in time, offered a glimpse into a history that had shaped the world forever.